Another element that we want to think through as it relates to the theology of the passage and what the author was trying to communicate to the original audience in terms of theology is ethics. And so when we think about ethics, we're really asking the question, what was the original author intending for this original audience to know, believe, feel, and do? Okay? So let's look at these three examples again and begin to think through these examples from an ethical perspective, or what the author was intending to communicate in terms of what his original audience wanted to know, believe, feel, and do. And so Genesis 21, one of the things I would say that Moses, in writing this, was intending to communicate to his original audience, who were Israelites who were wandering in the wilderness after their exodus from Egypt. Okay, to know and believe that God would provide for them as covenant children. And again, this even is a bit of a contrast, that here God is providing for a non-covenant person, a non-covenant child, but here they are as Israelites, and that God would provide for them as they're wondering where their next meal was going to come from, as they were wondering if they were going to have water to drink, that they could know and believe that God would provide for them as covenant children. Next, that God hears their cries of desperation. Again, as they cried out in the wilderness, as they wondered if they were going to have water to drink, that God hears. That God is the God of Ishmael. And that God would make them into a great nation despite their inadequate provisions. Again, just like he did to Ishmael, that God made him, with promise to make him into a great nation, that here again as a covenant children, or a covenant nation, that God would make them into a great nation despite their inadequate provisions. Next, that they would feel desperate yet grateful that God does hear and provides. They definitely felt, if you were to read the narrative of them being in the wilderness wanderings, I mean, they definitely felt desperate, but their desperation didn't lead to gratefulness, and certainly didn't lead to them calling out to God. It led to them complaining and becoming bitter. And so they were to feel from this story, I would think, that desperate yet grateful that God does hear and provides, and to turn their cries of complaining into open-handed prayers, and to look to Him, to God, for their provision instead of looking to their lack. Okay? So, let's think now about the story in Luke 7. In terms of ethics, we want to think through what was Luke maybe wanting his original audience to know and believe: that Jesus is God and longs to forgive those who come to him in their need, that Jesus always welcomes the outcast. You never see a story in the Gospels where an outcast is shunned by Jesus. And so Jesus always welcomes the outcast. That self-righteousness hinders genuine love and worship, to know and to believe that if they want to genuinely love God and worship him, that self-righteousness stands in the way of that, and that Jesus gives peace. To feel genuine gratitude and worship for being greatly forgiven. This woman's exuberance in her worship was replete with feeling, emotion. And I think Luke is calling believers to that same sense of overwhelming gratitude and worship for being greatly forgiven, and the peace of Christ that comes from being greatly forgiven. And then to do is to recognize their great sin and come to him in their desperate need for forgiveness, to forsake pride and self-righteousness, and to worship and love Christ out of a response to his forgiveness. Now let's look at Ephesians 2, 1 through 10 in the same way. Let's think about ethics and what Paul was calling his Ephesian friends in the church of Ephesus to know and to believe. That apart from Christ, they were desperately lost and under God's wrath. Again, this is one of those things where we can forget. If we've been walking with Christ for a while, we can almost get to the point where we can forget how desperately lost we once were. I mean, he's speaking here, he's writing this to believers. They were saints. They had their inheritance secure in Christ. So why is he walking through who they once were in 1 through 3? It's because we can easily forget. And so he wants them to know and to believe that apart from Christ, they were desperately lost under God's wrath. But that God, in his grace and mercy, made them alive, raised them up with Christ, and will forever be the object. They will forever be the objects of his grace and kindness. Again, something else that we can forget. We can forget our identity in Christ. We can forget grace and mercy and the lavish love of God. We've got to be reminded of that over and over and over and over again. This is what Paul is doing with these believers in Ephesus. Next, that all of this happened simply by grace through faith. And how easy it is to forget about grace. How easy it is to begin to feel like we need to work our way back to God after we've sinned. But that he's done all this because of grace through faith, and that it happened so that they would now walk in good works prepared beforehand for them. And so next we want them, I think Paul wanted them to feel exceedingly grateful for God's saving grace, humbled and worshipful because of God's gracious hand in saving them in their sins, and then to walk out the good works they were recreated for. Okay, so those are examples for ethics. In the next video, we're going to talk now through how do we check our work, and all that we've done, how do we check our work?